Okay, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. We are joined once again by Father James Dominic Rooney, and we were just having a lively discussion backstage on a topic that's not at all related to what we're going to talk about now, but maybe we'll revisit that in a future episode on political philosophy. Today, we're going to stay in the realm of metaphysics. We're going to discuss classical theism and panentheism. Can these play well together? What the differences are? Father Rooney has a fairly recent article, I believe it was in Religious Studies, if that's correct, offering a critique of panentheism. Now, it was a good article. I'll be sure to link it, and so we'll dive into the contents of that a little bit. But I want to, I kind of want to zoom out, before we kind of like get right into the tall grass. Maybe what we could do is just do a bit of stage setting, especially for classical theism. What are some of the motivations behind it, and then we should also distinguish between pantheism and panentheism, and then we can compare and contrast and see where the conversation goes. How's that sound to you, Father?
Fine with me.
Great. Well, first off, welcome back. It's been several months since you've been on the show before. So before we get into it, if you wouldn't mind, just a brief reintroduction, what you've been working on, what you've been up to, all that good stuff. Mm-hmm.
So I'm Father James Dominic Rooney. I'm here at Hong Kong Baptist University. So I'm in Hong Kong now. And I teach philosophy primarily. Metaphysics is my area. I do medieval Latin and medieval Chinese philosophy, as well as philosophy of religion and philosophy of political philosophy. So in terms of things I've been working on, I was telling Pat before the show, I've got a new edited book coming out, Beyond Classical Liberalism, Freedom and the Good, in February, coming out through Routledge. Me and a Jesuit worked together to edit this book. And it's sort of alternatives to classical liberalism and political philosophy. So that's coming out. I have a number of different articles coming out. Like I have another article on some of these same themes coming out in Nova et Vetera, The Ends of the Divine. It's a critique basically of Sergius Bulgakov, Jordan Daniel Wood, David Bentley Hart. They have a kind of there's this kind of view going around that's really behind some of this Orthodox panentheist paper by Jeremiah Carey, which is like God couldn't have done anything else except create this world, this particular world. There's some sort of relation between God and the world. So I have that sort of stuff coming out. I have some stuff on public reason naturalism. I have a few other papers. I have a paper on the sin of the devil coming out, diabolical disregard.
Oh, important topic. Very important topic.
Philosophy.
I'll be curious.
But the big one you're going to be so excited about is I finished writing my manuscript for my book on hell.
Yeah.
Hell.
That's gonna help with your name. Didn't you pick up the nickname Father Hell in these debates?
I know. I'm that guy. So the book will cement that reputation, hopefully, for good or ill. So I finished it, and I'm in the process of sort of editing it and going through it with people to check the arguments. But it's basically all written, so it's probably not going to come out though till late next year sometime. I don't.
Yeah.
But I'm going to work on it over the summer to finish editing it. But Not a Hope in Hell. Really, the problem is it's not on like. It starts with some of the concerns about universalism,
Yes.
but the actual point of the book, by the way, is really about why God allows sin.
Mm-hmm.
So I argue it's sort of a serious problem about why God allows sin. And, and the thing that's interesting is all of my discussions with these universalists like David Bentley Hart and Jordan Daniel Wood and some of their weird theology of God really prompted me to see deep interconnections between some of these problems that I hadn't thought about before.
It's all systems thinking, of course, right? It's like, why are we over here? Well, it's because of something over here, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyway, that's sort of interesting, but just to let people know it's not reproducing anything I already wrote about this for like Church Life Journal or something. It's really an independent question about why God allows sin. And I sort of argue that like universalism would make that problem worse. So we should that's a bad answer to the why God allows sin question.
Oh, I agree. I agree strongly with that. Can we talk about that just for a second? Is that
Sure, go ahead.
I talk about this in the book that I just had come out with Sophia. And to me, where you situate hell and how you think about hell is really important, because I agree. If you don't have hell and you're a universalist, I think at the end of the day, you've got a real problem, almost a utilitarian problem of why God allows sin, right?
Yeah.
However, if you're not going to have hell just exacerbate the problem of evil on the other end, then you need to have hell form a basis from which you can effectively respond to the problem of evil. And I take it that that's actually Stump's view at the end of the day. And I think
Yeah. So
something in that direction is the right way to go about it. If that I'm sure that makes sense to you. I'm not sure if it makes sense.
By the way, that's, if I can put it this way, I'm big kudos to Eleanor. I think she helped me see a lot of the way to fix this problem, or the way to better think about it. So
Yeah.
my view isn't the same as Eleanor's, but I appeal to her views a few different times, especially on the atonement and the wandering in darkness and image of God.
Mhm.
So I appeal to things like the true self. She talks about an image of God.
Yeah, it's a
And
great book.
basically, if I can put it this way, I think if you're a universalist, you have a serious problem that goes like this. Why, if God necessarily, given his character, given his love for us, he can't but ensure we're all going to achieve union with him, why does he allow sin, even temporarily? So they basically, because they think it has to be necessary that everyone goes to heaven, that God ensures everyone achieves union, they sort of have to give an explanation of sin that either makes sin metaphysically necessary, like Thomas Talbot seems to think if you don't have that, committing sin time, you're not going to be able to go to heaven. So that's like why it's there, is because it's somehow metaphysically necessary, or maybe you think God can't stop it, So I think those are bad positions. I leave it as an exercise for the reader. Okay.
Yeah, this isn't our main topic today, so you can just give us the ingredients or seeds or highlights, and then we'll
Yeah. So yeah, I think or they argue that the sins are literally pointless. God allows them for no reason. They're just there. I think that's bad because God doesn't love us because he allows it arbitrarily. Or I think this is sort of a David Bentley Hart kind of view, is maybe the sin is really an illusion. It never really happens. I think some universalists have a view like that. I think all of these answers are bad. So my view is worked out in the other chapters. I give an argument why I think universalism is necessarily false. So I give an argument why I think it cannot be the case. I appeal to classical theism, and I argue that universalism requires denying classical theism.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, we'll look
by universalism again, I always mean this sort of given God's character,
the strong form universalism, right?
Yeah, because I basically start the book out and I say the other view is not terribly interesting for this purpose. So the rest of the book is sort of working out basically how God doesn't cause sin, but he allows it. He merely foresees and allows it. So that's one chapter, and then the last chapter is sort of like why God would allow it, what reasons he would, why God's allowance of sin is good for the people he allows to sin.
Yes.
So that's the difficult case, which I think allowing hell just sort of brings out the problem, right? Because the people in hell, it looks like, well, of course, hell is not good for them, right? So you have to sort of like, explain why God allowing hell is good for the people there, even though hell is not good for them. That's sort of the same problem, right? Why God allows sin, right? Even though sin is not good for anybody. Right?
I'll be very interested to read your full account and compare it with Dr. Stump's as well. And when that book is closer to release or it releases, we will definitely have you on for that discussion. That'll be great. Now, before anyone starts jumping into that debate, because I know that one always, invites a lot of comments. That's not the topic today. Restrain yourselves. We're going to just talk, more, I guess. Nothing's bland, right? Everything has consequences and implications and devotees and all that. But we're going to talk about classical theism and panentheism. So, yeah, let's back up. Father Rooney, 101 foundational. What do you see as the sort of primary motivations for classical theism? Why are you a classical theist? Why do you think that this is sort of the right fundamental metaphysical perspective worldview stopping point? Let's start there.
Yeah, so let me just try to, what is classical theism? So classical theism first is basically a term to just differentiate one form of monotheism from basically these other ones: pantheism, panentheism, polytheism, process theism, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Usually it got introduced because it was there was this theistic personalism stuff in contemporary philosophy of religion. We don't need to get into that for my
Right.
purpose. But classical theism, basically, the distinguishing stuff of classical theism is that whole list of those classical properties of God. He is all-knowing, all-powerful, immutable, doesn't change, impassible, suffers nothing. He's eternal. But the most important property for our purposes is God is entirely simple. So divine simplicity is sort of the property, we might say, per excellence, that sets aside classical theism from other views. Now, some people have slightly fuzzy views about that. Like Duns Scotus has a formal distinction, and some people say, maybe there's different ways to do classical theism. But for my purposes, I'm just going to say classical theists think God is completely simple. There's no properties. There's no really distinct nothing in God. Everything in God is identical to God. That's
right.
That's classical theism.
Ontologically simple, exists with an exclamation point. That's it, right?
And he exists a se, so he is not dependent on anything in any respect whatsoever. That's sort of the point of divine simplicity, by the way. It follows from the view that God is a se. So here's then my reason why I'm a classical theist. So I don't have too much to say about this, except to say I just think the other views are incoherent. So when you think about why we believe in God, I think it's pretty simple. You think there's a first cause, there's an ultimate cause that explains like why everything exists, with the completely unrestricted quantifier, everything, literally. So he's the ultimate ground of being of anything. So if God is like that, then it seems like the problem is if God had like parts or other stuff that was somehow essential to God or somehow part of God, it's like God depends on something else, is sort of the problem. So then God wouldn't be a se. Now that's compressing. People debate this to the nth degree in contemporary philosophy of religion. So I'm not going to pretend that answered everything. But that's basically the idea, is composition in God. If he had some properties or ability to be otherwise, or like he could take on different real properties, really distinct properties, So the classical theist people say, well, of course, God has certain kinds of properties. Like we say, he's immutable, he's eternal. That's a property, true of God. But they're not really distinct properties.
Right. We're predicating it, right? But we're not saying that there's some property that is itself ontologically grounded in something more fundamental.
Yeah, there's not what we would say is like a metaphysical part in God.
Right.
A property of certain kinds is like a metaphysical part, like my being red because I have a sinus infection is a contingent accidental property of my face, right? My face isn't always.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's an example of a property God can't have.
Yeah.
Now, God can have a property like this. This is a case that's discussed in the classical literature. God is creator.
Right. Yeah.
So that God can't be creator without there being creation. But God doesn't undergo any intrinsic change.
Right. It's a
when he
Cambridge
becomes creator.
property. Right.
Yeah, we call it a Cambridge property. Now, a Cambridge property is pretty simple. It's like, here's my hand. My hand doesn't move. My hand is to, I don't know how the mirroring works. My hand is to the left of my finger. Now it's to the right.
I could also just grow taller than you, right?
Right.
Require a Cambridge change.
So those are where the thing doesn't change, but it has some new relation to something else.
Yeah. Now I think this is interesting because again, there's a lot of debate here. We don't have to get into all the weeds now, but you said, you're being red. So there's the existence of you, there's the existence of redness, right? But just those things in some doesn't entail the concrete state of affairs of you being red. What ties those things together, right? That to me is a very important and fundamental question. And I hold that there's got to be a thesis of dependentism, right? It's not that it's just an irreducible brute fact, right? It's not the state of affairs that ties itself together. And there's not any internal constituent, right? There's nothing about the nature of those constituents that entails they be related in just that way. You would destroy the data of contingency if you did that, right? So I think once you understand these perspectives, it immediately starts to push you towards this idea that contingent complexes always sort of point out to an extrinsic unifier of those constituents, right? And
Yeah, I
in the here and now,
basically,
right?
Pat, I argued in my book on material objects. This was sort of my argument precisely for substantial forms.
Mhm.
I argued basically anybody that thinks there are material objects out there that have parts and they're unified, right? They form one thing, even though there are different parts that somehow are together, material parts in this case, right?
Yeah,
Um, and you think there are extramental facts about this, right?
yes,
Like these things really are one thing, but like
right.
the moon is
There's a
not floating
fact of
on
my
my head.
kid's bed, right? That it is a
Right,
bed.
right.
Well, that
So
might not be the best example for substantial form,
that's
but
what
right.
I argued is like all you need to get substantial forms. Because what you need to argue is you need to hold then. I gave a definition that was just mereological. I said, you're going to think there's something here between the material parts that is what we call an improper part.
Yep.
So it's not a part, it's a part that overlaps all the other ones. It's a part of all the other material parts. And it's like that in virtue of which they form a whole. Well, that's just the definition I give of a substantial form. That's its functional role,
Right.
is just to be something like an immaterial part, a part that overlaps all the other material parts, and is that in virtue of which they form one thing.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, that's sort of the idea, is because the material parts are only contingently related, you need something to explain why they're here together now. And even if they were in some sense essentially related, you're gonna be able to sort of ratchet it up, right? Insofar as the parts are essentially distinct, like that's all you need, right? You need to say this part is not that part, and then you've got to explain why they're together,
Yes,
right? Even
right.
if you think they're somehow essentially connected to the thing in question, like you could have essential properties of a human being, essential propria. Like here's an essential propria of a human being.
A
Propria
brain.
is a medieval term, but it
Right.
means what we would think of as a property. It means like an essential accident, something that follows on.
It's tied very closely to the essence or nature, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is something like this: only humans have it, and it's a property that only humans have. So in this case, it would be the ability to laugh is the classical propria of human beings, or ability to write. So in this case, however, you're right. Ability to write or ability to speak, as Aristotle says, doesn't indicate the essence of human beings. So then you still have to give an explanation why it occurs here, right? So even though you don't have to think of the properties as just totally contingently connected, you basically have the same thing, right? As long as you say they're parts and they're not identical, right? You got to give some explanation of why they form a whole somehow,
Right.
even if it's in terms of their essential relation to something else,
Yeah.
right? It's because they're not identical. That's all you need, right?
Yeah.
In order to say that they need to be one, is that there are two of them, two or more of them. You need to explain why they're one in some respect.
Yeah, and tracing that line of thought, you will just sort of get back to another instance of composition. Eventually, Thomas will say the composition between essence and existence, right? And there,
so that's the ultimate level, and I have an account of this. I don't think it's I think sometimes people mystify these things, but I don't think they're so super mystical.
On a level, it's very common sense. It gets very technical as you try to work through all the objections and stuff.
I mean, like this is welcome to metaphysics. I think metaphysics is something like this. It's a lot of obvious stuff that we just need to draw the sort of right distinctions so we don't get confused about.
Yeah, well, certainly if you're an Aristotelian Thomist, it's all about just.
I mean, logic and math is like this. I mean, logic and math is like this. You count numbers and things, and you make simple operations, and then you realize, well, hell, it implies all this stuff about like imaginary numbers and cardinals of infinity, and it just comes from pretty simple stuff. So I mean, I think metaphysics is just like that. Now,
I agree.
I'll just end a little bit by saying the one paper I did write that you might refer to in this context is I did give an argument something like this exactly in a paper I wrote called Being a Not Quite Buddhist Theist for Religious Studies.
Yeah, haven't read that one, but I'll be sure to catch up.
In that one, it's kind of an interesting point. I like these medieval Confucians, and they were mostly fighting medieval Buddhists. That's how sort of the Confucians started doing metaphysics in the Middle Ages in China, was the introduction of Buddhism and their fights with Buddhas.
Sure.
But the Buddhists had, there's a school called Huayan that is a sort of interesting school. They had, there's some contemporary defenders of them that I used in my metaphysics book, the material objects book, Graham Priest and a few other people. But I sort of argued they have an interesting view where most Buddhists deny that there's like efficient causality. So when the missionaries went there and tried to do like the Thomist, first way cosmological argument stuff, a lot of them just sort of deny that efficient causality is like real. They think it's like, if I can put it this way, it's like Humean regularities.
Sure.
Nothing really, there's stuff happening, but it doesn't really depend on each other for its existence. But the interesting thing is, it doesn't really matter. You can give an argument of a similar kind just in terms of formal dependence.
Yeah.
So the Huayan Buddhists sort of were idealists. So they like Yogacara, one of the Indian schools of Buddhism, thought that there was like a mental stuff or like one big mind that all the phenomenon is occurring in. So that's why they thought like there's no causal dependence out here, but it's like all a dream in God's mind.
Sure.
Sort of, and I just argue, well, if that's true, it turns out you can just generate a different kind of argument for God's existence that way, in terms of dependence on the natures of things.
Sure, right.
So formal causal dependence on natures. And it's a lot like what you're talking about. My paper sort of ends by saying, I think, well, the Huayan people are like these panentheists, and those views end up being incoherent. So that's why you might think there's either it's a sort of theistic view, or it's going to be this kind of pantheistic view, which I think is sort of incoherent. I try to help them and say, well, I think in reality, they had views that were kind of pantheistic, but it's what led to the downfall of their system because it was kind of inconsistent for Buddhists to hold some of those views.
Yeah.
So I think it sort of collapsed under its own weight. But some South Korean Buddhists of the Zen school in Korea, Chan, they have some of these Huayan views that are sort of pantheistic, in my opinion. Anyway, it's just sort of interesting because
that is interesting. That's really.
So if you want like how to work out some of those thoughts about like dependence among parts, like that's exactly what I'm doing in that paper, is going through like, how you'd give an argument about dependence on parts and that.
Yeah, well, I will link that as well. I've shared this on the podcast many times. I think Barry Miller's actually got a really great argument along those lines himself, and from existence to God, that to my mind is extremely powerful. Also extremely technical. That's the other issue with Miller. But we'll put that aside. The simple idea for now is that classical theists are arguing or contending that, hey, if you want to kind of get to a principled stopping point for why anything exists at all, and you don't want to just kind of, wind up in a brute fact that is not like categorically different than stopping at a brute fact within the natural world, then it seems like it's sort of classical theism or bust. That's the cartoon sketch version of it anyways, right? Okay, so where do we want to... Yeah, I feel like just because it's a cartoon version doesn't mean that it's totally inaccurate, right? Where do you want to start with pantheism and panentheism? Perhaps we should distinguish these views, because look, I think there's a number of Thomists out there. In fact, it's funny, Father Rooney, I won't mention his name because I'll hopefully have him on soon, but before we scheduled this, I already had a Thomist scheduled to come on to kind of argue that there is a way of thinking about panentheism that is friendly with Thomism. Now, I don't know what his argument is because I never got to have that conversation, but there are people out there that think these views can play somewhat friendly together. It's funny. Kind of the thing I like, I guess, about your spirit and your work is you are willing to be friendly at certain times, but you're also willing to be very critical at other times. Because I'm thinking back to your other article on the essence energies distinction, and you think that there's a friendliness there between certain Eastern thinkers and Thomists. But in this article for panentheism, you're not that friendly. You don't think that they're that they're compatible.
Yeah. So I mean, actually, at the end of the paper, I am more friendly to the panentheists. So I try to, if you can put it this way, undermine the motivation at the end of the paper. So let me just say a few things. I'd be interested who that Thomist is. I don't know if you want to share his name. Her
Yeah,
name.
he won't mind, and he will come on. It's Dr. Robert Delfino. We were just kind of texting and chatting, and it came up, and he says he's been thinking about it, and I think he's going to try and write some stuff on it. So he'll join
Yeah,
me
so
at some point.
I think part of the difficulty here is I'll just throw it out there. I mean, even when I wrote this paper, I have like a line in there right at the beginning. Panentheism is a slippery term, and nobody is really sure how to define it most of the time. So I think this is sort of a difficulty of the view, and I'm not always convinced. People use the term sometimes and say, I'm going to give you a Thomism that's friendly to panentheism, or, there was a book that's cited at the end of my paper where there are some Orthodox theologians that say, okay, well, our view is close to panentheism. And I know Dr. Stump actually says this at times. She's said in my presence that her view, the theistic view of classical theism, could be close to panentheism in some ways. And I think she's right. I mean, so we need to kind of get clear on what it is. So
Yeah.
I kind of, if I can put it this way, I sort of stipulate a definition, and then I say, well, this guy that I'm talking about, Jeremiah Carey, he says this.
Yeah.
And that's what we mean in this context by panentheism.
Sure.
So,
right. And if you mean something else, that's a different discussion, right?
Exactly. So you don't have to take my word as gospel. It's sort of stipulative because I think everybody has their own sort of characterization. But here's my sort of stipulative definition. Pantheism means identity. So God and the world are identical. So I'm thinking of like, Advaita, Shankara, right? The world is literally identical with God. Okay, that's pantheism. I think that's the sort of view maybe the Huayan people have. Okay, then you have panentheism, and panentheism is used many different ways. I tend to think that it's obvious from the way people tend to use it, classically speaking, like these famous people that argued for it, like Alfred North Whitehead and people. I think they clearly means something that is not classical theism. So it was associated classically with like process stuff, process theology. Okay, so what is it? I think it's basically a view like this: the world is a part of God. So I often talk about it as a parthood relation, but I understand parthood in a kind of broad way because, as I said, I wrote that material objects book, and I think like there are what we'd call metaphysical parts, like properties. So whatever the world is, it has something like a parthood relation to God. Or, you could have it the other way around, but I think the basic idea is something like the world is a part of God. God is bigger than the world metaphysically, but the world is some sort of part.
Sure.
Has a parthood relation to God. So I said, I think that's the way to think about it. That's how I think about it, but you don't have to think about it that way. So what I said.
And let me just pause right there, because I think that's totally fair. We know when it comes to certainly pretty much any area of philosophy, people will use the same descriptor, but often mean very different things from it. I engage a lot with naturalism, and there's many different flavors and brands of naturalism out there. So like the best I can do at the end of the day is say, look, here's what I mean by naturalism, and here's a bunch of people that seem to mean the same thing, right? And I completely, concede that there's many other people out there that might also call themselves naturalists and mean something totally different. And if that's the case, then we'll just have a different conversation on it.
Yeah, I think naturalism is even broader than panentheism. I think people mean it in a slightly more definite way. But part of the problem, if I can put it this way, God bless and keep them, theologians are not always very precise. And the theologians like to write about this. And this is why I didn't go into contemporary theology, because a lot of them seem to study much more, sociology rather than,
sure.
logic. And when they define this stuff, it's sometimes just incoherent to me. So I can't figure out what they're talking about a lot of the time. Now, I think some of them mean good stuff. I don't think it's all bad. So that's sort of the friendly thing I say at the end. But the view I criticize in the paper, just to give you one case of what we mean by panentheism, is the view that God's energies is what this person is talking about. So we'll just say divine ideas or God's energies or something like that are literal parts of everything that exists. So some other people who like David Bentley Hart, this guy likes David Bentley Hart, but David Bentley Hart at some points, some of his followers seem to have this view that like God is the being of every object, right? This is a view like Aquinas deals with in the Summa Contra Gentiles. There were people that thought this stuff. Some people have thought something like this. This is a view also Aquinas gets in the medieval period from, what's his name, David of Donat, which is like prime matter is God, the matter,
Sure.
the stuff everything is made of.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like those are views that you sort of find today. So this guy in particular that I'm dealing with thinks like God is the substantial form of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Now he doesn't say that. That's sort of a little bit of my gloss there. He says these constitute, the energies constitute every object.
Yeah.
And I think what you mean, he says they're the forms of every object. And I think what that has to mean is like what we'd call a substantial form.
Sure.
I think we can't be like a universal or something. And he clearly doesn't mean it as a universal. He means they're in the things. Right?
It's immanent, right? An immanent or like Aristotelian form. Sure. Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's some sort of Aristotelian, form. I think it's a substantial form. But that's a clear version of what I mean by panentheism. So that's how I deal with it.
That's the target, right? And if somebody else has a different understanding, then we'll have a
and maybe it's helpful before we go any further, just to like end with that nice bit at the end where I'm trying to be nice about this. Is there's this guy who I really like who works on this. I mean, he's a sort of friend of mine, person I admire. There's two people. There's Mariusz Tabacek, who works at the Angelicum. He's like pumping out books left and right, and a bunch of his stuff is on panentheism and why it's metaphysically incoherent. And he has a kind of friendly view about how Thomist classical theists can get that sort of intimate God-world relationship without panentheism. So that's sort of, if you want more of that,
I guess if you're concerned, and this is a concern again of many different theologians, is just the kind of concern of the cold distance of classical theistic conception of God. Right now, how do we have the intimacy? How does God really love us if he doesn't bear a real relation to us? How do we make sense of deification? Like, I admit there's a host of questions and issues that are raised. I think there's good answers to them. Yeah. But if you have those concerns, then maybe that's one of the resources people can
Yeah, I tend to think, if I can put it this way, I think a lot of it is sort of mixed up. Okay, so I mean, mixing up things about classical theism with like deism or something.
Yeah.
So in my mind, a lot of it is sort of false dichotomies. So that's sort of what I say at the end. But I'm not totally unsympathetic. So I said, well, firstly, one of the points about, for example, talking about, so there's another guy in my paper that I cite whose name is I'm trying to figure out how to pronounce his name here for you. Benedict Goeke. Benedict Paul Goeke. He has a number of articles on pantheism, one of which is like, there is no pantheistic paradigm. He has some good stuff about it. But one of the things he points out is he thinks, well, basically what sets panentheism apart is that they think God has a necessary relation to the cosmos. I think this is another good way to put it. And I think it's basically parthood. That's my account. But
sure,
I think it's basically supposed to be like a necessary part, right? Anyway, but I say,
it's almost like the world is a propria of God in a sense.
Yeah, something like that. David Bentley Hart basically has a view like that the world is a necessary accident or a necessary result of God's activity.
Yeah,
it's necessary to another.
That's interesting because it brings up the issue that I've been interested in for a long time of modal collapse. And most people would say, well, you're just accepting modal collapse at that point. And I guess what they want to say is, well, no, technically the world isn't necessary through itself. It's necessary through another. But I don't think that resolves the fundamental issue.
Accept modal collapse and turn it into their theology.
That's exactly, if to me, you are just effectively conceding modal collapse at that point. Yeah. Even though, granted, the world still has a dependence relation, but it's a sort of this necessary flow from the divine essence that God really could not have done otherwise, right?
Yeah, so that's my Ends of the Divine paper, by the way, is all about that view.
Okay, I'll have to read that one. I haven't.
And I basically argue it's really the same thing as what we call radical canonicism. So they seem to think it's compatible with classical theism, but it's, in my mind, very obviously not. but they basically just accept and think all of the modal collapse stuff is good for them. So that's sort of, if I can put it this way, that's just the view. So it comes from Sergius Bulgakov, who has a kind of wacky view about that. But I mean, I think his view is panentheistic pretty through and through, and I think he even says it. I mean, he's pretty obvious about it. So, but now let me just say what's my sort of nice view about it. So, I mean, I think a lot of the Orthodox people who, in fact, talk about this is, I think, the difference is this, right? So God doesn't have a real relation to the world. We say he has a logical relation or a Cambridge relation, but that doesn't mean that the world doesn't have a real relation to God.
Of course it does.
Right?
Because we're talking about really just the order or direction of dependence when we talk about these types of relations.
So the world depends on God. And you can even say exactly what like David Bentley Hart wants to say. He wants to say something like, if the world is not necessary, then it doesn't really reflect who God is. But you don't have to say that the world necessarily proceeds from God to say it necessarily reflects who God is, right? Everything God creates is created by means of his word. So everything reflects the nature of God necessarily, right? Mm-hmm. Nothing could exist that does not reflect God's goodness and his personal nature. So I think there's a mistake there. But I mean,
I agree.
if you look at, there was a sort of edited volume I cite by these Orthodox people who talk about, right, God's relation to his world is necessarily personal, or by means of his energies, or the world necessarily reflects God's character, right? Or everything is in God in some way. All of those are perfectly normal things to say. And you can give perfectly normal Orthodox readings of all those things. And I think, like, yeah, there's something like, if you want to put it this way, classical theism is not supposed to be the like last thing you say about God, right? It's just a framework for talking about what God is in the classical paradigm as from himself, simple, all that stuff. But like, there is stuff that like Christianity adds, obviously, which is that God is personal and God has a Trinitarian nature and he relates to the world in that way. And the world is a free creation from God's decisions. Now, actually, I think to the contrary, Eleanor Stump is the one who sort of, I mean, she mentioned some of this and I thought, oh, this is a good idea. I mean, one of the things that's obvious to me is, if the world was not necessary, then of course, God choosing to create this world in particular is precisely, I think, more dependent on him, right? More reflecting what he is, because it's a free choice of him, right? So there's a way in which this world is more radically, he's more radically in love with it, because God being in love with something that is not himself is different than him necessarily loving himself. So if he creates and it's really separate from himself, I think it creates a more radical kind of dependency and a more intimate relation in a certain way. But I just point out, though, the other Orthodox who do try to argue for this, clearly emphasize that God could have not created. So they basically hold the Orthodox line, but try to explore ways in which, we can affirm the things the panentheists want. Sure. And the last thing I'll say,
sure, not just to be clear for everyone else, not all panentheists are committed to that quite strong claim that really this world had to flow from God, right?
Yeah, I don't know. It depends on who you're talking about. As I said, Benedict Goeke tries to argue for that, but I don't know. As I said, I'm not really invested in a definition of panentheism. For all I know, I don't know. But I just wanted to end by saying, the other thing that was friendly is, I think a lot of people are sort of a lot of the concern about panentheism seems to me to be about grace, about our personal relationship with God, not about all this other stuff so much. But I think the thing that's interesting about that is I think they're just mixed up on the nature of justification and stuff. Sure. So, I mean, like one of the things
everything's connected, everything matters, right? Yeah.
One of the things that is interesting that I think you could affirm is precisely you can affirm a kind of contingent parthood relation between parts of the world and God. So here's precisely what Aquinas says. He says that grace makes us divinized by formal and not efficient causality. So grace is a part of us, right? Well, it strikes me as that's much of what like Gregory Palamas was trying to insist on too. I kind of, refer to Palamas because I like him and he's mentioned in the original article.
Yeah.
But I think the basic idea is for panentheists, the relation is something like necessary parthood. But I think a contingent kind of parthood relation, like Aquinas's or Palamas's theory of grace, that we have a contingent, parthood relation that could have failed to obtain. I think that makes perfect sense. And I think that's like how you can get a lot of the stuff about panentheism without the panentheism, happening, right? So
okay, that's interesting. I would have to think about that a little bit further. I know that what motivates a lot of the debates on the essence energies matter again is issues concerning grace and deification and stuff like that. So it doesn't surprise me that would enter in here. I guess I'm willing to say, like, depending on what we're talking about, I think I would certainly be willing to go down that road a bit. Like if I think of God's knowledge, when we're talking about God's knowledge of me or of you, then I would say God's knowledge is partly constituted by objects extrinsic to God. However, I would say God's active knowledge is not. That's perfectly simple. Immutable
I'm
and
not
so
sure
on.
what it means to say his knowledge is constituted by things extrinsic to him, but let me just gesture toward what I think is interesting about this. So you're going a sort of way that I'm interested in. So I say the parthood here is really something like personal relation. So I say, by the way, this is chapter 3 in the Hell book.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think we are
headed
book
in 2, chapter 2 in the Hell book, by the way, is called Persons, Not Parts, where I think like the parthood relation is just misunderstanding stuff. Where I think something like what's interesting is what does the intimate relation that we want is the personal being of God. That's what the energies are supposed to get you. It's God's personal relationship to things, his hypostatic relation to something, and his personal operations. So that's how we come into union with God for Aquinas and Palamas, is our knowledge and love of God. Now, interestingly, one of the things I like from Stump, by the way, is she said something like, well, she was trying to be friendly to like panpsychism, everything is mind. And she said, well, God calls everything by name in the Bible. So God can have a personal relationship with everything. And the closer you are to God, the more you have a personal relationship to everything. Like, brother, sun, sister, moon, St. Francis, right? St. Seraphim of Serov. I think, like that makes good sense to me, is like precisely because God has a personal relationship to things that he creates. He calls them by name. I think that's the way to go toward what we want for like panentheism, is something like that, the personal nature of God, rather than any of this stuff about parthood. So I think the parthood is sort of a distraction. I think they're trying to do something, but parts don't necessarily have that intimate relation, right? I don't have an intimate relation with my toenail, right? I mean, so
I should throw my wife into it, but she didn't even have one anymore. She had an ingrown toenail. She had to get it removed. So
and that's another thing, right? We sometimes disregard our parts or get rid of them, like an ingrown toenail if it gets infected. And parthood is not sufficient to account for the intimate kind of relation, where I think like personal love is. So that's my own view. Is
interesting. Okay, that's
I like the panentheist is getting to something that's true, but like I think they miss it. They're going for parthood, but that's like the wrong way to go. What you want is persons.
Yeah. So this is good. Okay, so those are some definitely friendly remarks. I think it's always good to try and build those those common commitments and say, I see what you're trying to do here, and that's good, and I appreciate that. I think about it maybe a little bit differently. I think that's always a good tone and good approach. Okay, so in your article, you kind of have two general lines of critique. You have one where you're saying, just looking at Palamas, you don't think that this position is correct, and then you have your sort of metaphysical critique as well. Do you want to maybe give us the highlights of both of those, or just focus on one? However you want the conversation to go here.
So let me just I'll just give you the highlights of the one, and then we can move to the metaphysics, because I think that's
Sure.
probably what you're more interested in.
And for people, you do have, I believe, I don't know if the article itself is open access, but you had a preprint, I believe, on your academia page, right? For people who want to
Yeah,
read the whole
all of
thing.
my articles are preprint on my academia and Phil papers. So I
Right.
try to keep everything up to date. And it's not always very well edited, because it's usually, of course, the pre-edited version.
Sure.
But
But hey, it's about bringing philosophy to the people, right?
Well, exactly. That is my motto. I think open access is beautiful. So
I agree. So, and let me emphasize again, these conversations, part of the reason I hold these conversations, try and hopefully make them helpful and educational, but also to invite people to go read this stuff, right? You gotta go deeper. So obviously we're not gonna be able to cover everything, but I'll link the articles in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this Orthodox Panentheism, so my university has open access with religious studies. So that's sort of why I've been publishing a little bit more in them, is because all my articles for them can go open access.
Oh, good. Yeah, good. Yeah.
Anyway, so the basic thing is, the first part, I'm going to be real brief with it, is Jeremiah Carey. Well, it might help to sort of like set up the situation again a little bit. So, I mean, Jeremiah Carey, the person I'm writing against, sort of argued that Latin theology had this kind of classical theism that was bad news, because it sort of cuts the world off from God, whereas Greek theology, good Greek theology, Eastern theology, had the idea that the forms, God's ideas, could literally be parts of things. And they could be parts of things without making God's essence a part of things, because of the essence energies distinction. So saying God's essence is not his energies allows us to say those energies are literally parts of things, without saying God's essence. Everything is God's essence, or is identical with God's essence. So this is what he thinks is cool, and he cites some patristic data that's supposed to support this from a number of different people, like Athanasius, Nazianzen, Nyssa. The problem I like point out repeatedly as I go through is, I think a lot of the quotes are just taken out of context, and it's pretty obvious once you get the context, I think, that the quotations don't support the view that the God's ideas, or God is like a form of objects, or is there, formal being, or whatever you want to call it. So I think that's sort of the basic idea. And I should say I go into two in particular, I think, is like Maximus the Confessor and Gregory Palamas. And I think it's a pretty straightforward misreading, because here's sort of the obvious thing. Palamas, on his one of the works that he's citing, I'm forgetting which one this is. I think it's the Topics. Let me just check here in the list on the.
Sure.
Doesn't matter so much, but it's the Topics of Natural and Theological Science in Philokalia 4. The Topics, Palamas gives a sort of intriguing quote where he says something like, God both is and is said to be the nature of all things. And that's what Carey cites. And I point out, right, he's missing part of the quote. Insofar as all things partake of him and subsist by means of this participation, in this sense, he's the being of all beings, the form that is in all forms, as the author of form. And I think one of the things Carey keeps saying is like, God is not an efficient cause. He's somehow in it. And I think, well, his qualifications are pretty clear, like God is the agent, right? That's the sense in which he's the form. And he says other places, God is not a form, nor does he possess a form, Palamas claims. So
Sure.
I think it's a mistake. And the most obvious reason I think it's a mistake is Palamas's Topics begins with a whole section where he argues that God is not the form of the world. So it was a well-known position because it was a view of like Plato. And so Palamas and many of these other patristic authors argue specifically against it. Like
Sure.
Basil and people, they all know this view that the world has a world soul. And they argue that that's pagan and it's bad and it's you should reject it. And I basically think this view that they're pushing is just that view, right? The world soul view. And these people knew this view, right? So you can just look at what they say about it and, they reject it and they give arguments against it. And you can tell then, I think their views are not going to be the same, right? They can't make those arguments. I go through like Nyssa and Basil, and I'm like, here's the arguments they make. And it wouldn't make any sense for them to say this if they thought, God's ideas or God or the word was like the literal form of objects, right? Because then
Yes.
he'd be the world soul, right?
Yeah.
So
Right. Good. Okay. Good. Yeah. So that'll be of interest for I guess a number of people, especially if they're coming from a certain Palamite tradition, to be sure. So unless there's anything else you want to say more on that front, you're right. I think what would be of more interest and importance here would be the metaphysical
yeah.
critique. So where do you think because your article again is I forget the exact title, but something like it's not orthodox and it's incoherent, right?
Orthodox panentheism is neither orthodox nor coherent.
There
I
we
think.
go. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Very very friendly title, right?
yeah, I know. I was pulling out the cannons on that one, but
Is that one of
I
the
mean,
ones where you adjust the title after it's been accepted, or did you go in with that
no,
one?
that was the going title.
That's good.
Some of my titles
Bold.
are quite
I like
nuts,
it. Yeah.
but I
Because
like.
that's a trick, right? You go in with a modest title, it gets accepted, then you make it more aggressive.
No, I never do that. Actually, it's usually the opposite.
Yeah, don't be Weasley about it. Yeah, lead
Yeah.
with your best, right? Yeah, for sure.
So I like the fun title. It's also what I found is I always gave kind of boring titles in the past, and so these titles are in many ways more descriptive and people remember them.
Yeah,
Anyway,
and provocative too. It's first interest for sure, right? Yeah.
a little bit, yeah. So in terms of the to get onto the metaphysics a little bit, so I've written some stuff about Palamas. By the way, that's where I was in Houston. I was giving a paper on the Palamas, responding to a new book on that by.
Okay, so it wasn't all fights about integralism then.
No, sadly, but I had a nice. I gave a paper on Tikhon Pino's book Essence and Energies and Gregory Palamas, and I have a view that I proposed, which was just you mentioned it in that classical theism, the Fuqua and Kuhn's edited volume, classical theism, and in that I defend the idea that I give a charitable reading of Palamas because I was always frustrated. People read Palamas and like I read him and I couldn't understand why they thought he was like in conflict with Thomism. I mean, like you could imagine there are sort of obvious things that look weird for a Thomist, but I mean, like what he actually says seems, coherent with Thomism. He tries to rule out, that his view is in conflict with divine simplicity. And it always confused me that people were like so quick to say, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about. That's sort of the response by some people. Anyway, but that becomes important because the metaphysical case here, whatever we think about divine energies, I have a Thomist interpretation of them, but in the context, an energy is supposed to be something that like is a basis in God for some relation, either a relation like to something ad extra, or even like a negative relation ad intra, like being immutable is something like a relation of God to himself. So energies are supposed to be something like that, some sort of basis for relational terms in God. And he refers to those energies as uncreated, and they are eternal and essential to God. So that's an important claim. And he repeatedly says they're not properties, they're not accidents.
Yeah.
So they're neither inseparable nor separable accidents, he says many times.
Yeah. I don't think anybody wanting to hold on to divine simplicity would want to put any sort of accident in God, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I just sort of take him at his word, but it doesn't matter for my purposes here. I just point out whatever we say they're supposed to be. The point is, if whatever they're supposed to be, Palamas thinks the products of the energies are contingent. So like creation is a product of the divine energies, but creation itself is not a divine energy. He's clear to distinguish them.
Yeah.
Because he says, if created, he says, this is a quote from my paper, he says, created things are not the energies of God, they're the effects. For if created things were the energies are uncreated. So things would be uncreated. Or else prior to the created things, God would possess no energies at all, right? Prior to their existence, God would have properties that change over time, right? If the things that exist were the energies and they came into existence and out of them, right? My phone didn't exist forever. So if my phone was somehow composed of a divine energy or identical with a divine energy, something in God would change over time,
right.
So it's pretty obvious to me, he thinks that God's energy is eternal and uncreated, and it can't be a part of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the problem when you think these energies, God's ideas or God's energies, are somehow constituents of things in the world. Is like, well, the things change over time, so God's essential properties would change. Because for Palamas, the energies are distinct from the essence, but they're both God. I mean, that's like key to the picture, is like when he talks about grace, he says we participate in God by means of the energies. But he says we participate in God. We're not participating in something else, right? So it's really important that the energies are God, that they're not something else. He calls them anhypostatic. They don't have their own hypostasis, and he calls them enousion, right? They don't have their own essence apart from the essence of God.
Sure.
So I think that's a problem. Carry, you might think maybe those energies are sort of like, maybe they can be a formal cause that's like akin to a human soul or something.
Mm-hmm.
So like they're separable from the stuff they inform, right? They can inform multiple stuff or something like that. But the problem would be, it seems like you'd still need an account of why they come to inform one thing at one time rather than another. That's one problem you'd have. It would seem like the divine energies might have these contingent relations to things. But in fact, I mean, if God had an energy that was distinct for each thing, then God's energies are clearly essentially differentiated, right? There would be an energy for my phone. There'd be an energy for me, even when I didn't exist. But it would seem like if there's an energy that constitutes me, it would be a sort of essential dependence. God would have some sort of essential content that depends on me existing,
Sure.
right?
Right.
So even if the energy was eternal, it would somehow be essentially related to me, which would be a problem from classical theism, because God has no really distinct properties that are essentially related to anything.
Yes. Right. Mm-hmm.
God being creator doesn't require the world. Either it's an extrinsic predication, the world exists, therefore he's creator, just in terms of that relation.
Right.
Or
right.
when you say God's creator, you just mean he's like capable of creating or something like that.
Right. Right.
So I think also there's a problem on this view, which is like, why would you need the forms of things to be divine energies? But like, what would the matter be? Why wouldn't the matter also have to be a divine energy or something, right? What is the other principle here? It looks like I'd worry about a kind of Manichaeanism, right? Matter is somehow like a separate principle from God.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Right.
And what form does it have, or something like that? Or what would be the limiting principle? Why are these things not identical with God?
Yes. Right.
So that's sort of a problem. But even if you just, as I said, consider the point that the energies are somehow right, essential to the things they inform. That's what you have to say, is like, this energy is the form of my phone rather than the form of the cup I have here.
Yes. Right. Yeah. That to me seems immediately and obviously problematic if you're trying to hold to any classical theistic conception of God. Right.
Yeah. So that's sort of the problem. Is Palamas himself rejects that, right? He says things created are not of the very nature of the creator. He says stuff like that. And he says, like, the capacity people have to become divine and the way in which they participate in the energies, it's not as if they become by nature divine or that they're a part of God. He like cuts that out. He says that's wrong very clearly a number of times. So I think the worry then is, if some relevant aspect of God, whatever you want, like his energies, his ideas, hypostases, functions like a part, then God's being is necessarily or essentially related to what he creates. And that would be bad, because then God wouldn't be, God would depend upon those things.
To be God. Right.
Yeah. And so that would just like create an ontological circle.
Yes.
Right? Because God's supposed to be the explanation of why things have the natures they do and why they exist and all that stuff. But the things out here in the world are what sort of like determine why God's the way he is. And that doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
That just creates a vicious metaphysical dependence.
I agree. And if you're going, this is why I, this is kind of my friendly, and it's a sincere friendliness. There's a lot of to naturalists. There's a lot that I, coming from a naturalistic background, there's a lot that I still see within the naturalistic paradigm that is attractive to me. And one of those things is, trying to lean out your ontological and theoretical commitments, for one thing, like that is attractive to me. Now, I think you can actually do that more with classical theism, at least on the fundamental level, than naturalism. But the other thing is that, like, hey, if we need to explain this type of thing in the natural world, but you have that same type of thing in the supernatural world or realm of God, then I'm just going to cut that off, right? I'm just going to, and like, to me, I'm like, that is a totally fair point, right? Like, I don't want to get in a race of like who has fewer brute facts, right? Like either like we can drive brute facts to zero, which means like we better not have the same sort of things that seem to, point beyond themselves categorically in the supernatural as we have in the natural. Like, we either have like a really principled sort of category shift away from that, or we don't, right? And just like having, well, I got 3 brute facts, you've got 1,000. That to me doesn't make a difference. Honestly, it doesn't. So to my mind, this is where I'm actually in strong agreement with a lot of naturalists. I'll sort of disagree, that naturalism at the end of the day is a simpler, theory, and that the theist is stuck with brute facts. But to do that, I think you need a very kind of robust conception of classical theism and this sort of radical like God as the limit case instance of being, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, you do have these types of issues where it's like, I know people hate when you say this, but I think it's true. Like, have you really escaped the creature category at this point? Right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let me just say one thing about that, which is I'm not very convinced that naturalism posits less brute facts or something. So that's one thing I'd say. I don't get into those debates too much. I have a problem. I think the existence of God is too easy to prove. So I just find it kind of uninteresting.
By the way, I don't think naturalism posits less brute facts, because I think with classical theism you can eliminate brute facts. You can get to zero.
Yeah. I think that's true, and I think if I can put it this way, I think actually the main difference. So I'm writing a book on meta-metaphysics as well.
Nice.
I've written a paper that's coming out about that, the meta-metaphysics of form, and it comes up in that Buddhism and theism paper. But I think a lot of the differences that are going on here are really sort of meta-metaphysical ones. Mm-hmm. I think actually the naturalist and me are really close. So my motivation in metaphysics, and the way I consider metaphysics, is like metaphysics is like a scientific sort of thing. It's a sort of abstraction from facts from natural science. That's my classical view. We have these river forest Thomists. Okay, I have a sort of like view like this about metaphysics. Is like metaphysics is meta science. It's sort of philosophy of science. But so my views are close to naturalism in many ways. I mean, I have very naturalistic accounts of morality and stuff. But I think a lot of the people that are attracted to this kind of panentheistic weirdness are like the Buddhists, for instance. And I think they have a weird metaphysics. I think they are thinking we don't need to give any kind of truth makers for things. Maybe everything's just in our head. We're just talking about phenomena, right? How can we know what's out there? I think a lot of the people that are attracted to this kind of panentheism are sort of operating in something like that. A lot of times is like a different kind of mode of what we're doing when we're doing metaphysics. Because I'm like interested in, truth making, grounding, the sort of normal stuff that I think is like
right. Like I cannot shake the truth maker intuition. Like, to me, it just seems so obviously more right than any objections that have been brought against it. Right?
Yeah, where I think some of the people who are in on this are sort of like they're more interested in a different kind of project. So I think at some point there's probably, I think these views are incoherent, but like as I point out with the Buddhist, I think maybe for some kinds of panentheism it becomes much harder to refute because they can make it very consistent as a kind of nominalist view, and then it's like hard to talk about. Now I think these panentheists that I'm talking to, like Jeremiah Carey and that, are not that far gone.
Sure.
So their views are more like, I think I can be super critical in a fairly straightforward way because they're making claims about things being forms and that, right?
Yeah.
But
there's more shared commitments between the two.
Yeah. So my sort of point though is like, you can get a more sophisticated version of this panentheism from like the Huayan people, or
Yeah.
like the Indian, Hindu tradition in metaphysics. And then it becomes harder to make the sort of arguments I'm making now.
Right. Yeah. As shared
Because
commitments fall away,
they're
it
going to
makes it
sort of
harder.
reject these sorts of metaphysical circles, and they're going to think they're not vicious, or they're going to have other
Yep.
kinds of explanations.
Yep.
By the way, that's what I'm going to talk about in my metaphysics book. Last chapter is why I don't like that, why I think they're wrong.
Yeah. No, that's important, and that is
But it
a different
requires a
debate,
lot
right?
more
Yeah.
work. It requires a lot more work.
Of course, yeah, because as your shared commitments fall away, right, you're
Yeah.
getting, it's just more difficult to stage that sort of project fund, and that's a really important thing to bring up, right? When you have more of those shared commitments, then it's easier to kind of like focus in on what you think the issue is and launch a critique from foundations that you have in common. But yeah, that's right. It's very, very difficult. I think this is just a general issue with so many, including between theists and naturalists. Right? People don't understand. It's not like the classical theism and naturalism is like, oh, you have the natural world and then you add one more thing. No, how you conceive of reality, soup to nuts, is like totally different as a classical theist and a naturalist. But that's not something you really appreciate unless. And I guess I have the advantage of kind of coming from a naturalist perspective, like of how different the paradigms and conceptions it's really actually quite hard and painstaking to make, I think, fair and thorough evaluations of these paradigms, because it's not just like one more, one less thing. That's just way too crude of a way of thinking about it. Right.
I think that's sometimes how they're thinking of it, and it's sort of, they're just working from the wrong angle. I mean, like, that's sort of my impression when I said I get kind of bored with the talks about the existence of God, is basically that. I think, like, yeah, you just don't understand what we're talking about. We have to just like go back to basic sort of first principles and work it out. And I think you're just, criticisms often seem to me to miss the forest for the trees kind of stuff.
Yeah, I agree, and at the same time, just to be fair, I think there's many theists out there that effectively see the world as a naturalist and just think you should add that one more thing, and I think they're missing it too, right?
Yeah, so that's the criticism many people have made of like these theistic personalists, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I have somebody I know well, who I'm not going to mention, who he's one of those sort of people, and he's like criticizes me. He's like, well. God changes his mind over time. God is not immutable. And I'm like, don't say that. Don't say that.
You're triggering me.
You're around me. Go do something elsewhere. But he also likes Molinism, so he's all full of Jesuit nonsense.
Oh man, Molinism. Let's do a conversation about that sometime, because Molinism, to me, I think Norris Clark, who was a Jesuit, had the absolute just perfect brief critique to Molinism. On paper, it looks logically impeccable, but if you think about it for 5 minutes, it's metaphysically absurd. And I think that is the right assessment of Molinism. Of course, you got to spell that out. I also just think that Molinism doesn't actually solve the issues it contends to solve fundamentally.
Actually, by the way, in my Hell book, I talk about this, chapter 3. But that's my criticism of it. I just don't think it actually solves the issues. I think it just sort of shifts them somewhere.
It pushes it around. Absolutely, yeah. Fundamentally, especially if you are committed. If you're not a universalist, and a Molinist, then I don't think you actually avoid the issue. You just kind of delay it or relocate it. But we'll revisit that at another time. This has been great. Do you have any final words and anything you think that we missed that you just want to kind of insert quickly? Otherwise, just remind people where they can keep up with you and your work.
Yeah. So I don't have anything specifically to add. I certainly appreciate the conversation. As I said, I got some books coming out, so feel free to follow all that stuff. I do all sorts of crazy stuff all at the same time. So I'm doing political philosophy, philosophy of religion, metaphysics, Chinese philosophy. I just sort of mix and dabble. So feel free to follow any of that.
Yeah.
Follow any of that on my two places I keep putting up the papers are philpapers.org and academia.edu on my page there. I have a Google site page. You can go to HKBU, our religion and philosophy department, and find me there. And there's a link to my personal website. I have my CV, and I have the link to academia and Phil Papers right on there. So you can look there and find some of the information about me there too.
Awesome. Well, I'll be sure to include that in the show notes. If people made it to the end of the conversation, I thank you for being here. Whether you agree or disagree, we welcome your comments below. Hit subscribe, hit the like button, and we'll see everybody next time. Take care.
Yeah, subscribe to this dude.
Yeah, please.